series of conversations we've been having this term on the question of the humanities' role today. I'm especially happy to see people turning out at this awful time of year when I know some of you have papers to do and papers to mark. But I think the attendance that we've had for all of the sessions has been a sign of just how important this discussion is for us to be having today. It's something we've all been thinking about individually, and it really helps to have these opportunities to talk about them together. We've been hearing a lot of different thoughts about why what we do matters. Some of them have been quite personal, some philosophical. All of them have been in different ways critical, and in many ways, I think the discussion itself seems the best evidence of what we do and why it's important. One of the things, though, that we've seen is that it can be hard to talk about the value of what we do, especially in a world in which economics drives decisions and everything seems reduced to market value. And we often do try to justify ourselves in those terms. And one of the things that our discussions have been getting at is just the inadequacy of this. And we need to find another way, too, about talking about what's important for us. One of the contexts of this discussion is, of course, the sense that there is a crisis in the humanities, which is related to the fact that humanities graduates never get any jobs. This is a kind of story that's perpetuated, although, as we've seen through a number of presentations, actually the statistics work against this, that show that this is not true. The humanities graduates do get jobs, although it's not as easy, obviously, for someone coming out with a degree in English or philosophy or Italian as for someone who's coming out with a degree in medicine or engineering, where there are jobs that are directly related to the program that you've been following. But the issue is that the fact is that humanities students do get jobs, that they have skills that make them appropriate for many kinds of careers. Now, this is also something that we've been coming back to at a number of times. The fact that humanities graduates have what we're calling transferable skills, and it's something that I think it's important for students to know and kind of be reassured about. But we've also seen the real limits to and the kind of objections that people have to this idea here. For one thing, it seems to kind of lump humanities together in a rather homogenized way that's misleading, because although we do share commonalities, different disciplines have different strengths, and disciplinary specificity is something that I think is very important for us to be thinking about and defending, and not trying to sort of globalize sort of the humanities and what they do and what they offer. So I think that's one of the problems with this idea of the transferable skills. The other is that it just doesn't seem kind of true to experience. I don't think it's the reason why people go into the humanities. It's not to acquire transferable skills. That's not the way that people are thinking, that these skills are important as a kind of side effect, that they don't define the real value of what we do to us as individuals, and I think in a broader sense. And I think this is related to a question that we haven't been addressing directly, but has kind of been at the sort of the periphery of all our discussions. The question of not just the role of the humanities, but really the role of the universities today, what universities are supposed to be and do. And we know, of course, that historically the purpose of higher education has changed greatly. This series started with Sue Morton from the Department of History, who was talking about the role of liberal arts education in Canada in the 20th century, and how it changed in the context of World War II, and then and during the Cold War, as social needs changed. And people like me, of course, think of the ideal of humanitas in Renaissance education, the fundamental idea, belief that to be a human being you needed to master a varied curriculum, which included not just literature and philosophy and history, but also math and science. There was a very broad spectrum of knowledge that you needed in order to be a human being. And the purpose of this kind of education was seen as the cultivation of the individual, but not really for personal self-fulfillment, although ideally that kind of came as part of a package deal, but for active service to society. that this kind of education is needed for public servants, basically. Now, in certain ways, I think that ideal is still with us today, because one of the things that's been coming up in the different conversations is the feeling that learning does enrich us as individuals, that it leads to a good life. And it also helps us enrich society. As I've been thinking about changing place at the university, though, I found it ironic to remember how, or maybe appropriate, I guess, probably more appropriately ironic. About 10 years ago, in England, trade schools, polytechnics, were turned into universities. And it seems to me that since then, inversely, there's been a gradual drift of universities towards being trade schools, or an assumption that one studies to get a job. Now, obviously, no one studies to not get a job. I mean, it would be hard to imagine any program that would sell itself by saying, study this and you're never going to be qualified to do anything at all. I mean, that's, kind of shooting yourself in the head. But again, I'm not sure how many humanities students, apart from some of you who are intending to be professors, would say that you're studying in order to get a job. That's not the motive behind it. And for me, that's really the interesting question that we're exploring. Why students are studying humanities, and that's why, as I said at the start, I think it's so important for us to be hearing from the students as well as faculty members in these discussions. Why people are coming to the humanities in today's context, in a world in which, from one perspective, humanities seem to be superfluous, unnecessary. It seems to me that our students are also telling us that they are perhaps more important than ever. So we've heard a lot so far from colleagues, both faculty and students, in a range of disciplines: history, English, political science, philosophy, art history and communications, and classics. And as well as presenters, we've heard a lot of very important ideas coming out from that discussion afterwards with people in all kinds of disciplines. As before, today we have 4 presenters, and what we're going to do is allow each person to speak for about 20 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to discussion, group discussion at the end, because I found that seems to be working best in terms of allowing some of the different themes that are developing in the presentations, in the whole session, and in the sessions as a whole to come out. So our first speaker today is Alex McAuley from History and Classical Studies, who, for the purposes of this discussion, I think has had a very interesting career, because while he was doing his undergraduate degree in history at McGill, he worked also as director of sales for the Montreal-based web and graphic design firm, The Message Studios. Then, however, he abandoned the corporate world for classics and is now working on his doctoral thesis on the local impact of pluralism and multiculturalism in mainland Greece during the Hellenistic period. He's published several current and forthcoming articles on Hellenistic dynasties, royal women, Greek government and federalism, and the reception of the ancient world in contemporary film and television. Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie, and thank you so much for that introduction and the preface, because it's always wonderful whenever your talk is introduced with every single buzzword that you want to bring up over the course of the apparently 20 minutes that I have. So I guess I can go a little bit long. Of course, first I want to thank Professor Kilgour and everyone else who's taken part in this series. Thank you for organizing this, thank you for putting it together. Thanks to all the previous speakers who have gone before me and spoken so intriguingly and honestly. And thanks, of course, to those who are coming afterwards, and most importantly to those who are in attendance either in the flesh or digitally. I think it's very refreshing, to say the least, in 2014 to see these really difficult questions be confronted directly, and to see the problem be stared in the face, as it were, when I find that so much more frequently in academia we're more inclined to slink away and try and avoid these really direct, this hard kind of candor, honestly. And the fortunate part of speaking in the third part of the series that allows one to respond either directly or indirectly to everything that's been said thus far. So part of my comments today are inspired by what people have said over previous sessions, and much of what I have to say is reactionary in nature. But I guess we'll just dive right into it. I take as my thesis this quotation from Act 1, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And I won't be quoting anything classical this time. In Act 1, Scene 2 of Julius Caesar, Cassius speaks to Brutus and he says, quote, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves." Lines 141 and 142. And this takes place as the two are lamenting over how Caesar straddles the narrow world like a giant, and how Caesar has come to dominate every facet of society in a way that they felt was outside of their control. And Cassius takes this moment to reprimand Brutus by reminding him that it's only they themselves, not the stars, not the fates, not society, not somebody else, that's really to blame for the situation in which they find themselves. And the words themselves seem to lend themselves fairly well to this time of crisis, either actual or perceived, as they were famously quoted by the wonderful journalist Edward R. Murrow on 9 March 1954 as the opening salvo of his attack on Senator Joseph McCarthy and his House Un-American Activities Committee. Later on in that broadcast, Murrow famously said, quote, "We are not descended from fearful men, but from men who fear to write, to speak, to associate, and to defend the causes that were at the moment unpopular." I'm going to get back to Edward R. Murrow and Cassius in this crisis a little bit later. But first, I think I want to just say a few words of preface from my own experience of how I wound up in what we consider to be an arcane and very irrelevant profession. Much of what we've discussed in these sessions thus far has revolved around this question of why. Why do we do the humanities? Why does this matter? Why do we care? What possible difference can this make in our market-driven society in 2014? Why do we bother? And I might disappoint some here when I say that I believe that there is no correct answer for this. There's no one-size-fits-all reason as to why we do classics or ancient history or the humanities. There's no one simple solution for why the humanities matter, and there certainly isn't one that encompasses the breadth and the depth of our different fields. In every class that I teach, in every course that I've given here at McGill, the last lecture, be it for Latin, history, classics and media, film studies, whatever, the last lecture that I give is always the why do we do this lecture? And it's designed to answer this question of why did students bother sitting in on this class and listening to me ramble on for hours and hours about these topics that seem so irrelevant and so detached. And it's a question that for them, the feedback has always been very positive, and for them I think it's a refreshing question here posed, especially directly and honestly. And in the course of preparing these lectures, I have recurrently found that there is no universal motivation for studying classics. There is no single answer. And the same is certainly true of the humanities writ large. And I think that for me to single out one reason as to why the humanities are important and put this above all others would be equal parts arrogant and pretentious on my part. We each have our own reasons for doing this. We each have our own mix of personal experience and preference and interest that has guided us down whatever path we've either chosen or stumbled upon that somehow led to academia. My own was a little bit more circuitous than most, and as Professor Kilgour mentioned, I used to be during the course of my undergraduate degree, the director of sales for a Montreal-based web design firm that started off as a very humble enterprise and then fortunately grew into something fairly big and also allowed us to pay for our tuition. So this was a handy thing at the time. It was a very rewarding experience, and it was certainly one that was quite revelatory, perhaps more so in retrospect and looking back than it was at the time when I realized. We may like to think that the corporate world and the academic world are mutually exclusive, that somehow they are the proverbial oil and water. They're inseparable, and never the two shall meet. But as it turns out, in my own experience, we have much more in common with them, and they have much more in common with us than we may like or want to admit. And I think that we perhaps have much to learn from our private sector colleagues. My first observation was that it was exactly the diversity of our educational backgrounds that allowed us to succeed in the world of web design and the tech industry. None of us had a business education, none of us did a commerce degree. We hailed from various fields like science, arts, engineering, philosophy, music. We knew nothing really about business or economy in a pure sense. But it was precisely that humanities and that scientific background that gave us the ability to learn on the fly, and that capacity for autodidacticism. And people noticed, and a really common question that we got in the profession was, what did you study? And they noticed this because we were able to write and speak coherently, we used punctuation properly, we didn't abuse the semicolon, we had emails that had less than 18 smiley faces in them, which is a rarity among commerce graduates these days, thanks in the room. And people noticed very immediately that we were something different, we had a different perspective to offer. And I have absolutely no qualms or scruples, and I have no problem in admitting that it was our traditional humanities or scientific education that was part and parcel, if not the key, to our corporate profitability. And I fail to see how such a concession could be branded as a bad thing, or somehow cheapen the utility of our own fields of study. The corporate world itself is many things. It's cutthroat and demanding. It's driven by the sensibility towards productivity. It's efficient. It's sometimes inhumane. It is certainly collaborative, results-driven, and profit-oriented. It's responsive and dynamic. One must be profitable or one fails. One must pull their weight in a team or firm, and there is little tolerance for those who do not. One wonders, perhaps one wishes, what would the result be if we were going to adopt some measure of this corporate sensibility into our own domains. This sensibility towards productivity, efficiency, collaboration into our own structures and work processes. And when I say this, I don't mean towards this idea of the much maligned corporate university structure, whatever that means. But I mean more so on a smaller scale, in our own departments, in our own workforces, in our own teams, in our own collaborative efforts. What would the results be? And I suspect that this outcome would be interesting, to say the least. But of course, I left the web design world. And I could easily cite things like burnout, fatigue, being married to my BlackBerry, the unsustainable lifestyle, the demands of dealing with corporate expletive here, and moving along from there. And of course, there were many things that drove us away, but realistically, it was a crisis of Catholic conscience that led me towards academia rather than the corporate world. There was a moment, I guess, of sober reflection that led me to realize that it wasn't just profit margins and clever designs that I wanted to contribute to the world in some naive sense, but rather that we were capable of something better than that. It's not to say that the corporate world is either ignoble or inherently mercenary, it is just my own personal preference. And this, of course, led me back towards the world of academia. And I pursued a Master in Classics. Professor Beck has spoken quite well about the problem of classics in the contemporary academy. We are the irrelevant of the irrelevant. Nobody speaks the dead languages that we love and study with such detail. We study almost exclusively dead white men in a narrowly contained geographic zone. We are the first to be sacrificed on the altar of reform, and we understand why sometimes this happens. So I'm not going to elaborate about that. But when I made the switch to academia, I was told repeatedly and emphatically that I was entering a profession that was in crisis. I was entering a field that was allegedly poised on the brink of the cataclysm, and of course we know the common reasons that are cited about this all the time. Budget cuts, declining enrollment, apathy, lack of interest, people being driven towards the profitable professions or the real world, etc., etc., etc. And much of this dialogue, of course, was spurred on by many discussions, many reports, the terrific university experience of our colleagues in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. And most recently, we've seen this sort of explode in the digital sphere with this report by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that was called The Heart of the Matter, that analyzed both the problem and therefore offered suggestions for what we could do, where we could go, and what new approaches were called for. But in the midst of this climate of alleged crisis, I think there have been, unsurprisingly, many fingers pointed in equally many directions with various effect. But among all of them, I find, is this prevalent tone of the victimization of the academy, of the martyrdom of the humanities. The idea is that it is society's fault. It is their fault, not ours. And if it is our fault, then it's either limited to select individuals or our two very favorite scapegoats, the university or the government, one of the two. The idea is that we tend to try and find some kind of reactionary finger to point at somebody else. For instance, and these are great, because I love the academic world sometimes, David Brooks, who's a liberal arts professor in his own right, wrote in the New York Times, he blamed academics for, quote, committing suicide because many humanists have lost faith in their own enterprise. Verlin Klinkenberg, who's a prof at a small college in the United States, says the same thing using a different analogy of a ship where everyone's staring at the middle instead of looking out at the coastline, which is kind of an odd analogy to use. And then yet another prof, Stanley Fish, a New York Times columnist as well, he goes right around and blames the preceding two of them for using bad analogies, for having ineffective analysis, and then he goes forward and blames the report itself for what he calls to be vacuous and impenetrable language and logic. So it's all very academic, right? It's either other academics' fault or the report, or we're just going to blame the language. And then, of course, there are other people, like Scott Saul, who's another American academic, and he put forward the radical idea that there is, in fact, a crisis. That this crisis is really based on a small sampling of private universities in the United States, that humanities enrollments in public universities in the US and in Canada are doing just fine, and perhaps we're excessively worried about something that isn't necessarily there in practice. But throughout, as I mentioned, we have this idea of the academy being set apart. And I personally take great issue with the idea of academic exceptionalism. I take issue with the idea that we are somehow better, or that we are somehow set apart because we've chosen a different set of priorities, or a different lifestyle, or a different way of making our money than most of society, and particularly those of us who are in the humanities. And also this correlated notion that the world somehow owes us something. Do I believe in the inherent nobility of what we study? Of course, or I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be giving this talk today. And in the end, I think ours is a profession like any other. Though we have a different set of priorities, we are certainly a profession. We're driven by a different sense of profit, we work within a different structure, but in the end it's a profession, it's a trade. And I think we must market ourselves and carry ourselves as such. And if any profession is declining in numbers and popularity, then that profession must by means consider why its services are no longer in demand, and it must adapt and react, or it faces perishing. And so perhaps the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. And to resurrect the words of Cassius again, we have to think about this quotation of Shakespeare. So perhaps our collective crisis is the making of our own shortcomings in some ways, of our own trend towards isolation and insulation, of our resentment. And perhaps, to quote Edward R. Murrow, we must again do a better job of championing the causes that are at the moment unpopular. With our analytical ability, our breadth of learning, our rhetoric, our firm grasp on whatever facet of the humanities we have chosen to study, we should and indeed are able to formulate responsive and situational arguments as to why we should study, read, learn, and perhaps most importantly, fund whatever it is that we do. We are indeed capable, we just need, I think, in some ways to redirect our efforts. And I wonder to what extent the answer lies in social media, to what extent the answer lies in bringing Twitter into the classroom or trying to cram books into Facebook posts, or this alleged dilution of complex material for a popular audience that comes off at once as being condescending and somewhat supercilious. And I wonder to what extent we can really blame things like TED Talks for having the outreach and popularity that they do, if they are indeed an effective means. I take two brief examples to make my point. The first is from an eminent classicist, Robin Seeger, who's a favorite hobby horse of mine, because in 1979, and then more recently in 2008, he wrote and then republished a history of Pompey the Great, the famous Roman general who closed the Roman Republic. In his preface, he remarked that there was as yet no biography of the man in English, and thus, quote, a book in English on Pompeius should need no justification. This is not good. We cannot simply say that we should do something in the humanities because it doesn't yet exist. This is, or rather for the reason that it has not yet been done, and I think that we owe ourselves and the profession a better reason than saying that there isn't yet a book on the thing that I want to write about. The second example comes from McGill itself. As I learned recently through the vagaries of Google, we in fact have a SSHRC-funded research think tank project about the future of graduate education and training in the humanities, a topic which is near and dear to my own heart, facing the prospect of unemployment, which released a discussion paper in September of 2013. Among the topics raised was the general lack of permanent employment for graduate students in the academy after they finished their degrees. And they mentioned the rarity of PhD graduates finding either a tenure track or a permanent academic job within the profession. All of this, they remarked, is coupled with this general disdain among academics for those who have studied the humanities, either as an undergraduate or as a postgraduate, and then have departed to seek real jobs in the private sector or in the real world, right? There is this general attitude against those who do a doctorate, who do a master's, and then leave the academy and go and do something else. And I think that this pretentious attitude is at times, this pretentious attitude that such students have failed is decidedly not a good thing when we're thinking about our own impact of teaching and learning. But there is a section in this report that's entitled, quote, the humanities are important because they ... and then the report goes on to provide a list of bullet points. The last of these bullet points is how the humanities contribute to the economy, full stop. As justification, one author cites the productivity of academic and university publishing houses in North America, which offer a combined revenue of $2 billion, and also the Shakespeare Festival in Stratford, Ontario, which generates $60 million in revenue and a fair number of jobs. In perspective, the $2 billion economic footprint is 0.1% of the Canadian GDP and 0.01% of the combined American and Canadian GDPs of these two publishing institutions. Such claims, I think, in such small figures only serve to confirm our own irrelevance. I think that we can take a different approach, that perhaps we can take a different way of doing better than this, and I will take the typical departmental page trick of famous people who have done the humanities and gotten very good jobs afterwards. I'll take this approach as an illustrative way of providing another alternative calculation of our economic impact. According to the stereotype, and according to a delightful quotation from a businessman on businessinsider.com, English and history majors, as we all know, quote, only go on to sell shoes. This is, of course, his words, not mine. And the general impression is that we have lower starting salaries and higher unemployment rates than all of our other colleagues in the practical or the applied sciences or in the professional schools. This is a half-truth at best, and I don't say this as an historian, I say this as somebody who used to work in the corporate world. The calculations are based on entry-level salary at first hire in a directly relevant field after graduation, which we simply cannot calculate in the humanities. We don't have this direct way of calculating this. We also don't have, the humanities graduates tend to have lower starting salaries, but a greater earning ceiling and earning income potential throughout their careers than anybody else, so we can discard this on the side. But for the success stories and examples of our potential for economic productivity, here is a short list of people, and I quote various sources on the internet for this. Number 1, Mitt Romney. Probably not the best person to lead off with, but it's going to get better. CEO of Bain Capital and an English major. Peter Thiel, CEO of PayPal, was a 20th century philosophy major. Carly Fiorina, the ex-CEO of Hewlett-Packard, also studied philosophy and medieval history. The CEOs of American Express, the guy who used to own TWA and now invests in everything left, right, and center, both studied philosophy and other humanistics degrees. Michael Eisner of Disney was a double major in theater and English at Denison. Hank Paulson, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs and the Secretary of the Treasury, studied a humanities degree. He took an English major at Dartmouth. Another Goldman Sachs CEO was a government major. The chairwoman of the FDIC was a philosophy major. Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, was an English major. A hedge fund manager, Ted Turner, the founder of CNN and TNT, was a classics major at Brown. Incidentally, when he told his dad about this, his dad wrote him a letter saying, "I was appalled and horrified when you told me that you were going to study classics. I almost puked, full stop," end quotation. So this didn't go over too well in his response. The former CEOs of Xerox, Delta Airlines, the Bank of America, the investment firm BlackRock, IBM, Procter & Gamble, Sprint, Nextel, MTV, Disney, Sherwin-Williams, Fannie Mae also joined the list of people who studied what we would consider to be pure humanities degrees in their undergraduate. In government, we have such figures as the Governor of New York, Secretary of Defense, Governor of California, Vice President of the United States, the eclectic Mayor of London. The list can and indeed does go on. Also, now we get to the really good ones. We have people like Sacha Baron Cohen, Janine Garofalo, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Grant Hill, my beloved, though tragically not a player for the Senators, Ken Dryden, and perhaps unfortunately the wonderful combination of George W. Bush and Kourtney Kardashian, also studying arts degrees in their respective undergraduates. So we put this together, I think, so much for our lack of productivity, and so much for the lack of applicability of our own talents, and so much for our lack of economic impact. Even though we should perhaps not have to justify ourselves in such ways, we should perhaps not have to fall back on what we view as being materialistic and commercial things as these to find our raison d'etre. At the end, I think we must confront the reality of the situation. We must respond with whatever means we have at our disposal. And again, to quote Edward R. Murrow, we must champion the cause that is at the moment unpopular. And by means of conclusion, I think the humanities equally have a place in the academy and in the marketplace, and this diversity of application is not a smear, not some kind of degeneration of the profession. And their importance to society takes many forms and many guises and many different plays in many different arenas, whether we like it or not. And if indeed that place in society is in crisis, then perhaps the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. But so too, fortunately, does the remedy. Thank you.